But as soon as I got deeper into the science and understanding the different brainwaves, I realized that this is what's happening. The reason I'm feeling this level of anxiety in my body is because I'm in high beta. And so there are tools to actually get you back to a more regulated state. And as I started using those tools, I found ways to regulate my nervous system, which then got me back into homeostasis. And getting back to homeostasis meant I started plugging back into my creative state, my ability to retain and absorb and regulate my state of being at that moment.
Good morning, friends, and what a great morning it is. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Emergence Now, the podcast that unlocks new levels from within you by creating space you didn't even know existed. For those of you joining us for the first time, I'm Nikos Acuna, switching it up, tech bro turned inward and sideways by the belly of the beast we call AI. And I'm joined by my partner in crime, Dhiren, entrepreneurial endurance extraordinaire and family man. Dhiren, how are you doing on this great morning/evening?
Great morning or evening or afternoon, wherever you find yourself listening to this podcast. Nikos, I like the fact that you're picking up great morning because, why settle for good when you can have great?
I love it.
It's catching on.
It's catching on. And if you tell yourself that, which is the subject of this episode, every morning, it will be a great morning, right?
Indeed.
Right on. Well, if you've been here with us before, but haven't followed or subscribed, please do so. For the algorithms we pray to, could give us some karmic love and shareability. Thank you so much. So today, in the true spirit of mind-body connection that we're so passionate about, we are talking about neuroleadership, what it is, how the mind transforms us into optimal leaders, and how to program your subconscious for growth and impact. There really is so much to unpack here, but Dhiren, I'll turn it over to you first, just because I feel like we need a level set the same way that we did with AI and breaking down the neuroscience portion and the leadership portion. So let's start at the very ground level. What it is.
What is leadership? Let's start with that. So, there's a lot of buzz and terms and definitions around leadership, right? Especially these days, since we've got these celebrity CEOs that we celebrate, right? Especially in the tech space. So what is leadership? At the most fundamental level, leadership is the ability to influence others. You're trying to influence others to achieve a common goal, a common objective. It involves many different skills and qualities, but the key word, Nikos, is influence. We are trying to influence people around us to move in the same direction toward that North Star, that core objective. So leadership plays a crucial role in various aspects of life, whether it's in our personal relationships or a professional setting. So what is leadership at its core? It revolves around the ability to influence people around us in order for us to achieve that shared objective. So in the workplace, leadership is all about guiding, motivating, inspiring members towards that North Star. So the basic skills and capabilities of the leader is to inspire and influence. So there goes that word influence again, right? We are constantly trying to influence people around us. Our manager, the founder, the consultant, our team members. However, leadership is not confined to the professional realm alone. It extends to our personal lives as well. Whether we're interacting with our children, friends, our girlfriend, boyfriend, our spouse. So for instance, I'm a parent to two boisterous teenagers, and I often have to influence them to adopt healthy habits or to make responsible decisions. Similarly, in romantic relationships, I'll put you in the spotlight. So you may seek to influence Jordan to binge watch a show together on Netflix, right? You have to influence her because she may have something else in mind. And so you're both trying to influence each other, right? So in all these scenarios, the fundamental element of leadership is to influence. Who is a leader? By definition of the fact that we have to influence people around us, we're all leaders in the most basic sense. But here's where it gets interesting. In addition to leading others, we're also leading ourselves. We're all trying to influence ourselves to do the things that we said we're going to do, to achieve that goal, whatever it may be, right? To start a meditation practice, to spend less time on our gadgets, to start that business or that passion project. So self-leadership is the ability to manage our own thoughts, our own emotions, and our behaviors in order to achieve our goals. But how do we self-lead? One way for us to be able to self-lead is to better understand that supercomputer that sits in between our ears, right? Known as our brain. And so this is where it gets really interesting and neuroscience comes together. And I know you have some experience in neuroscience. And I remember we've had this conversation in the past. I'd love to hear once again your journey into neuroscience, because that was a really interesting story that you shared with me a few weeks ago.
Yeah, for sure. Neuroscience is definitely an interesting component of it, but I love where you started with self-leading, because we have to live with ourselves, our brains, our minds on a day-to-day basis. And as we very well know, it's always fluctuating and it's always changing. It's tough to stick with these consistent patterns, but when you reinforce these patterns, you are not just changing your perspective, but you are quite literally changing the way that your brain interacts with itself and the neurons that are interacting with itself. And we could dive into that. So what is neuroscience? Neuroscience is basically the study of the brain. And I am not a neuroscientist by any means, but I did have a bit of a research journey into it as I was exploring in 2012 the nature of creativity from a first principle standpoint. And for the audiences that want to understand first principles, it's been adopted very well from lots of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. And all it means is that you are deducing things that happen, occurrences from down to the atomic level. So in physics, how can you break down individual processes and parts down to the very, very smallest bits so that you could understand their interactions? And then how do they scale up into problems that you could actually solve for, right? So I was always fascinated by the different intricate workings of the human mind and the potential for personal growth like you are. And so my curiosity led me to essentially delve into the realm of neuroscience, where I discovered how creativity works and how this ties into consciousness and cognitive processes, right? But I wanted to understand what was actually going on in the brain. And so I found myself captivated by these things called fractal patterns that were coined by Benoit Mandelbrot, a French mathematician who basically found those first principle fractal elements. And what is a fractal? If you deduce an individual part, it has the same pattern as a greater whole. And then I started to see these patterns all around. Like, for instance, the alveoli, like these little intricate prints in your lungs, have the same kind of pattern as neurons in the brain. And they have the same patterns as TCP IP protocols, or the way that ants move in their little colonies when they're moving around, looking at their resources and changing things. And so these patterns exist all around us. And I was fascinated by those patterns in the brain and these ideas of fractal patterns as they relate to consciousness. And emergence, obviously, was probably the root of a lot of how I look at the world today and a lot of what the show is about. So this idea resonated with me, and I began to see the mind not just as this one singular entity, but as a complex network of neurons. And I emphasize the word network, and it's akin to these fractal patterns. And every component of your body and the brain is definitely combined with a lot of elements in your body, be it a chemical, educational, communicative process, or a psychological process. It has these intricate configurations that basically exceed the sum of their parts, hence emergence. So as I delve a lot deeper into this,
all roads lead to emergence.
That's right. So as I delve deeper into it, I began to see how individual consciousness basically contributes to this collective mind, right? This hive mind, and it relates to creativity. Like when you get an aha moment, what is going on in the brain? The brain is actually spiking, and there are a network of neurons spiking, like we talked about in our AI series, right? There is a network of neurons that recognizes a pattern, or when you have a light bulb eureka moment that says, oh, I've solved this problem for my go-to-market, or we finally found a good product market fit. There is a network of neurons that are interacting in the brain. And just as these fractal patterns create that spike, it's also creating this form of collective consciousness, which is much, much deeper than just the brain. But my exploration didn't even stop there. I became intrigued by these microscopic functions and how they relate to systems, organizations, and societies, and also digital platforms. So that's been the root of my research for over a decade now. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's driving towards this collective consciousness that's happening. And then you start to look at the earth, the universe, and everything as this interconnected biosphere that is alive. But it also comes back to that individual network spike in the brain. And that's really where I got interested in neuroscience, and I continue to explore it every day.
You have this really good video that explains all of that with imagery on your page, on your Instagram page. I've seen that a number of times, and it really clearly articulates what you just spoke about with the imagery, because you show the different patterns and the fractal patterns and the connections. And I thought it was really well done. I highly recommend the listeners to actually check out that video. Maybe we put it in the show notes. So this sets it up really well for neuroleadership, right? So neuroleadership is the future of leadership. It's a field that studies the intersection of neuroscience and leadership. So one of my mentors, Dr. Joe Dispenza, he's a neuroscientist and an author, has written several books on the topic of mind, body, and healing. So he, along with his team, have studied and have brought neuroleadership to a number of companies. And a number of those companies have been the early adopters in the sense that they chose to use this information for ways to understand how to better motivate, inspire, collaborate, be more creative within the teams. So some of those companies include Pfizer, Google, Cisco, Coke, Microsoft. So neuroleadership, it's still a relatively new field, but it's gaining a lot of momentum. And it's gaining a lot of momentum because of the advancement in brain imaging technology, like fMRI and EEG, which allows us to observe and measure brain activity, giving us this unprecedented access, insights into how the brain functions for leaders. So neuroleadership, it's a fascinating concept that combines neuroscience with leadership practices. It's like using brain science to become an even better leader. So it's a powerful tool that can be used to improve leadership effectiveness. So here's the deal. So neuroleadership takes all that amazing research that we have on how the brain works, which you just spoke about, and applies it to leadership development. So think of it this way. Our brain is the control center, right, for everything we do, including how we lead. So it's this sophisticated control center that doesn't come with an owner's manual. We've heard this before, right? So neuroscience has provided us with the insights and the functions of the brain, which then gives us the tools to be more coherent or to learn how to work with the brain in a more coherent way. So there are different tools and concepts from neuroplasticity, growth mindset, executive function, self-control, emotional regulation, stress management, how to change habits, how to change behaviors. So neuroleadership takes the understanding of how different parts of our brain affect our leadership behavior. Okay, so Let's break this down. We have essentially three brains. There are three parts to our brain, right? That allow us to go from thinking to doing to being. So let's talk about those three brains. So the first part of the brain is called the neocortex. It's the seat of our identity. It's the place where you have consciousness, where you have awareness. So you're listening, Nikos, to me right now with your neocortex. Everyone listening to this show is using their neocortex to process what I'm saying. And your neocortex then is what plugs you into three-dimensional reality, right? Through your senses, your five senses. Well, maybe six, but we're not going to go there. So every time you learn something new, you make a new connection in your thinking neocortex. And the moment those neurons string into place, like literally they string into place, we've seen videos that show how they string into place, the limbic brain then, which is the chemical brain, also known as the emotional brain, it makes a chemical. It generates this chemical, and that chemical is called a feeling or an emotion. So feelings like joy, fear, overwhelm, gratitude. Now, the third brain is the hippocampus. It's responsible for memory and learning. So what does this mean for leadership? So as a leader, you need to be able to, what does a leader do? A leader makes decisions. They manage their emotions. They learn from their experiences. And so these are all things that are influenced by the brain, right? So the prefrontal cortex, the neocortex, which is located at the front of our brain, helps us with decision making. It's like the boss of our brain, guiding us to make choices and solving problems as leaders. Now, why is this important? Why is it important for us to understand the three brains? Because when we understand how the brains function together, the different parts, how it functions together, as a leader, we then are able to really understand how we can improve our effectiveness. So in Dr. Joe's work, one of the pillars of neuroleadership, he discusses these different brainwaves and how they can affect our behavior and our performance. So really quick, I'll give the 101 on what brainwaves are. So when we have a thought, we create this electromagnetic field, which can then be measured. So we have essentially four brain waves. We've got delta waves, which are the slowest brain waves and are associated with really deep sleep. Then we've got theta brain waves, which are slower than the alpha waves that are associated with relaxation, creativity, and learning. Then we have alpha waves associated with alertness, focus. Right now, I'm in alpha, right? It is associated with creativity. Then the last and definitely not the least is beta brainwaves, which are the fastest brainwaves and are associated with attention, concentration, and we use it in problem solving. So Dr. Joe argues that we need to understand where we are in terms of our brainwaves in order to be effective leaders. So for example, if we're in a high beta state, we may be too stressed or anxious to make good decisions, right? So let me just break down the three levels of beta. There's low level beta, which is when we're relaxed and we're paying attention. So right now you're probably in low level beta, or you're probably between beta and alpha, right? And in beta, the brain has to create meaning. It's creating meaning between what's going on in the inner world, in Nikos's inner world, and what's going on in the outer world. Everything that I'm saying to you, it's basically coming in through your neocortex and it's making meaning out of it. And because our senses are plugged into the environment, that's a lot of information to integrate. And so the brain then begins to become more conscious. It's processing all this information, and that's called the beta brainwave patterns. So if you're about to get on stage, you're about to give a keynote, you may move from low-level beta to mid-range beta. Your brain gets a little bit excited, it gets a little perked up, the light bulb gets a little bit brighter, It's good stress. Let's call it good stress. But when you're angry and when you're fearful, when you get anxious, and when we're in pain, the brain goes into very high beta brain waves. In fact, more than 3 times as high for some people as low-level beta. And so now the brain is super aroused, and no new information can now enter the nervous system. And that's equal to the emotion, right? It's equal to the emotion that we're feeling at that moment. And it's not a time to create. We can't create in high beta. It's not a time to learn. It's not a time to lead. It's not a time to inspire. It's not a time to motivate. It's not a time to communicate with anybody. It's actually not a time to open our hearts. We can't, even if we tried. It's time to run, right? Or fight or hide. And so as we narrow our focus on the cause, we overanalyze and the brain goes into very high beta brainwave patterns. So we can't change, we can't transform in high range beta. We can't lead effectively in those moments.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I love that you reference Dr. Joe's seminars, and I know you have firsthand experience here. It obviously draws like a ton of attention to what's going on in the brain. But as you were in this environment and as you were learning about these different facets, were you aware of what was going on before? How aware were you? And what was it like to be in the room? What was the dynamic there? And did you feel yourself starting to change as all of this stuff was happening? Because a lot of the feedback, and I've listened to a ton of the podcasts, I've never had firsthand experience at these seminars, but a lot of the research is showing some pretty significant stuff, like people who were traumatized for 20 years have all of a sudden unlocked these new levels and have healed, or taking it on the far end of the spectrum, not to say that anybody ever got up from wheelchairs, but it sounded like there were these things going on where people thought,
oh, they have, by the way.
See, yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah. There's actually some,
I've seen it.
Let's talk about that, because I feel like we're diving into the brain, and it's interesting to know the different regions and the 3 brains and how brain waves tend to formulate how we behave and how we perceive things and ultimately how we're feeling. But what did this experience look like when somebody was actually transforming your very eyes? And yeah, dive into that, because that's super interesting.
Hey there, we're taking a quick break from the show to let you know that if you'd like to invite Dhiren or Nikos to speak at your next event on topics ranging from emergence and the inner game to the future of AI, we've got you covered. Simply email us at info@emergencenowpod.com. Once again, that's info@emergencenowpod.com. Now, let's dive back to the show.
So to answer your first question, was I aware of it? No, I wasn't aware of why I was not able to retain information, right? In the past, a few years ago, when I'm getting ready to give a pitch or I'm about to get in front of a board, I would prepare for that experience, and my body is going through that experience of anxiety, of overwhelm, of stress, because I'm stepping into the unknown. I don't know what's going to happen. Yes, I visualize. I try to play out exactly what the outcome looks like, and I work backwards. But I was not in a relaxed state. I was in high beta, which is why it was taking a lot more energy and effort to actually retain the information, to be able to feel comfortable in my body and to really understand what was going on. But as soon as I got deeper into the science and understanding the different brainwaves, I realized that this is what's happening. The reason I'm feeling this level of anxiety in my body is because I'm in high beta. And so there are tools to actually get you back to a more regulated state. And as I started using those tools, I found ways to regulate my nervous system, which then got me back into homeostasis. And getting back to homeostasis meant I started plugging back into my creative state, my ability to retain and absorb and regulate my state of being at that moment.
Wow. Yeah, that's super interesting, man. I mean, being able to fundamentally understand what's going on in your brain while witnessing firsthand these experiences in those seminars and actually starting to tweak your mind such that you can start to enter these different states is super interesting. But let's get a little bit more practical here. Like, fundamentally understanding these things in the brain and having all this background information is super cool. Geeks like us could definitely get into it, but connect that to leadership for me. Now, how can you take aspects and principles of neuroplasticity and start to apply them to how you are influencing others? And then it sounds like it's really important to influence yourself at the same time. What's the draw here for leadership?
Okay, that's a great question. We covered the first pillar of neuroleadership, which is really understanding the different brain waves. Now I want to cover the second pillar. The second pillar is emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence is not just a buzzword, it's a total game changer. So let's dive in and discover the power of it. So what is emotional intelligence? It's that ability for us to understand and manage our own emotions, as well as effectively navigate our relationships with others. So it's about being aware of how people who we work with, what kind of emotions they're going through. What's the impact of our communication on their thoughts, on their behaviors, and having that skill to handle them in a more constructive manner. So there are different frameworks to assess emotional intelligence. And one commonly used tool is called the Emotional Quotient Inventory, or EQI. So it's basically a self-report questionnaire that you can take online. And what it does is it measures 5 key domains of emotional intelligence. So I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I will just mention the 5, right? And if you want me to dive deeper into any one of these, let me know. But the first is self-awareness. We started this podcast talking about self-leadership. And self-leadership is only possible when we have self-awareness. So this is all about understanding our emotions and how they influence our thoughts and our actions. So it's like having that window into our emotional landscape. The next is self-management. And so this space or this domain really focuses on our ability to control our emotions and our behavior in a positive and productive way. It's also about staying calm under pressure and making choices that align with our values, right? So self-management, self-authorship. And then we have motivation. This is the drive that sends us to achieve our goals, even when we face challenges. It's about finding that inner fire in the belly to keep pushing forward and to stay focused on what matters most. The fourth is empathy, which is an essential domain. And then last is social skills. And that domain encompasses our capacity to build and maintain relationships, which is fundamental in neuroleadership. So when we have a better understanding of our EQ, our emotional quotient, it allows us to take that next step. It expands our awareness, not just of ourselves, but of the people around us. So by developing that emotional intelligence, we can now enhance our self-awareness, like I said, manage our emotions more effectively, build stronger relationships, and then navigate the complexities that we face in everyday life and in business.
Yeah, that's super cool. I think just to comment on some of those things, and I'm not trying to tie like a nice clean bow on everything, but what's bubbling up to the top for me is as you're managing these different frameworks with all of these principles, you're basically exercising neuroplasticity or brain plasticity and basically this superpower to change or adapt as you go through life. It's like your own personal workout routine, right? Because you're flexing and adapting as you keep sharp, and then you're maintaining kind of these different levels of awareness. So when you learn something new or you have like a fresh experience, your brain gets busy making these new connections and like strengthening the ones that already exist. it's literally like your brain is doing push-ups or lifting weights, the more aware you are of all of these things. And so you're getting stronger, you're getting more buff with each new thing that you learn, but you have to be aware. And especially when
takes energy.
It
takes energy.
But then like
awareness takes energy.
It does, but on the flip side, like if you don't constantly work out like you're doing in the gym, you're getting weaker over time. Like if you're not exerting the same kind of force, the brain's version of this is like use it or lose it, right? Like we've said numerous times on the show, like the neurons that fire together, they wire together. And that's ultimately how your brain stays efficient, is that if you could do these atomic habits, your brain is now, it doesn't have to focus on the lower level stuff because it almost becomes like automatic, right? It's the wax on, wax off motion of the brain. And it's not all sunshine and rainbows because neuroplasticity can kind of go the other way. It could help your brain bounce back from like lots of injuries or adapt to new situations, but it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So like if the changes in the connections lead to bad habits or negative thought patterns, or you stop focusing on EQ, it can basically contribute to different types of mental health issues. So the extreme version of this is neurosis, right? So when you have like lots of overthinking, your brain kind of short circuits, does it not? When you think about things too much and you get into these negative thought patterns, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel my brain fried when I'm in that neurosis state, right? Well, how do we actually then slow down our brain waves? When you're in that state, what do you do? As a leader or as a parent or as a solopreneur or an entrepreneur, what do you do when you're in that state? How do you slow your brain waves down? Because neurosis means you're hyperactive. So there are many ways to slow it down, to slow down your brain waves. But the number one go-to way, can you guess?
I'm doing it right now.
There you go.
Meditation.
Absolutely.
Turn it off completely.
Yeah, it's such a powerful tool for just slowing down your brain waves, right? And entering in that relaxed state. And there are many different types of meditation. And I think that's the challenge that some people face is, okay, well, do I do guided? Do I do silent? Do I focus on my breath, right? I think you need to do what works best for you. But the key thing is to just do it. So that's one of the most powerful ways to slow down brainwaves, especially for a leader, right? Just taking that 5 minutes and just focusing on whatever it is that works for you. The breath, the third eye, right? Maybe it's music, but just getting into that state is paramount. So I wanted to ask you a question. We were talking about self-leadership. So we've covered brain states and how to slow it down. And then we spoke about EQ, emotional intelligence, and we'll put the survey in the show notes. The third thing I want to talk about is around our core thought, right? So in self-leadership, there's this core thought. We all have a core thought. It's the first thing, maybe the first thought that you have as soon as you plug into three-dimensional reality. Because when you wake up, you're not thinking anything, you're not feeling anything, right? And as soon as you plug into three-dimensional reality, there's that one thought that comes up. Have you thought about that core thought? And most leaders, everyone, I would say, has that core thought.
And you're talking specifically about that state where you kind of crystallize into the experience of the three-dimensional world. I haven't looked at it from the frame of a core thought, though. It's more an intention than a thought. It's more, or
Beautiful.
It's almost...
So talk about that.
Yeah.
So you're conscious about the intention.
I'm conscious.
So that's your core thought.
Got it. Yeah, that makes more sense. It's more about how aligned am I to doing what I intend to do in a way that fulfills kind of this greater purpose. And I think it's also kind of
Beautiful.
Where I am in my life, in my career, in terms of if it's not a hell yes, then it's a hell no, in terms of how I'm prioritizing my time. And so, yeah, and that is ultimately always the question for me is just, is it aligned to my purpose? So I guess, yeah, you're right. In some senses, that would be my core thought.
Yeah. But before you had that core thought, before you woke up, there was this other core thought that was not as empowering. And this is what I find that leaders struggle with, is when they're on that journey and they're beginning to become more self-aware, they have this core thought. So I'll give you an example. So I had this core thought recently, and sometimes it slips. Sometimes we're not as switched on. Sometimes we're not as conscious. Sometimes we're not as aware. Life happens. So my core thought was, there's never enough time. This was in the thick of when I was at the final stretch of hitting the send button on my book. So I had this really tight deadline, and I think everyone can relate to deadlines, right? So at that point, when I would wake up, that core thought would come on. I had this looming deadline for my book, important project at work, whatever it may be. For me, it was the book. And the core thought was, there's never enough time to complete everything. And this triggered a cascade of events that impacted my well-being, my effectiveness. So first came the trigger, which was the thought, and then came this feeling, the emotion, which now basically translated from, it went from thinking to now it's in my body. Now I'm actually feeling it. I'm feeling the stress response activate. And now my brainwave patterns are starting to go into from low range beta to mid range to high range beta. And so now I'm starting to feel it in my body, and I'm starting to feel overwhelmed, and my productivity is now degraded, and I'm now getting in my own way. So this decreased my ability to focus, and the cycle continued on and on and on. And I think this is what I would encourage listeners to really think about, is what is your core thought? And once you're aware of that core thought, what happens right after that core thought? So just going meta and being really aware of the cascade that thought creates, and watch the brainwaves shift. And in that moment, now that you're aware of it, to actually now self-regulate and get back into homeostasis by using one of the tools, meditation being the one that we recommend. Of course, there are other tools as well, but meditation is the go-to. It's so easy. You can do it anywhere, anytime. And watch that thought dissolve. And watch that cascade basically stop in its tracks. And the reason I'm sharing this is because in the new paradigm of leadership, the smartest person in the room is no longer the leader, right? I've said this before. The leader is now the most conscious person in the room.
About how you can essentially reframe your core thoughts, especially when you are aware enough that you can see it bleed, or you can experience it bleed into how your emotions are reacting. So how do you flip that? The one in particular was about time. So how did you either reframe that or get yourself into a more optimal mindset?
Yeah, so it wasn't as much about reframing as much as it was understanding the shift in my brain waves, right? And that's really the key point in enhancing self-leadership. It's by recognizing that trigger and managing the stress and improving focus and boosting creativity and staying in that creation space as opposed to the survival state. Because I was in survival. As soon as that thought came through and I let it do what it was doing, it created this cascade. So in those moments, whether I'm trying to optimize for flow state or harnessing higher levels of energy or amplifying my creative expression, I had to get myself back from high beta to mid beta to low beta and back to alpha. And I did that by just getting myself into a relaxed state. Oftentimes what happens is when we are in high level beta, we continue to go. So as an athlete, you can't perform at a high level zone 3 or zone 4 for very long. It's all about variability. So in those moments, it's about being self-aware that, okay, I'm in high level beta right now, and no matter how much I work or how hard I push this project, I'm going to be dragging my feet and I'm going to get into neurosis, right? As you mentioned earlier. So it's about taking a step back and being self-aware as to where we are at the moment, what's the score, and getting ourselves back into homeostasis.
Yeah, Dhiren, that's super interesting in terms of getting back to homeostasis, which is a perfect lead into my next question is, how do you lead with that? Because I'll set this up with my own awareness of how I've employed this with my teams and things like that, right? Because I see a very key distinction when I've had a particularly brutal morning and I didn't get a good night's sleep the night before, or I didn't have enough meditation sessions, or I don't have the endorphins pumping because I didn't get a workout in, whatever the excuse is, right? Or I've had too much coffee and there was a particularly grueling project that needs to get done.
That's so relatable, by the way.
Yeah, totally, right? Because you're not in state. And so when you are not in state and you're overemphasizing, you start to focus on trivial little details and you start to bother people. It's like, well, when did this get done? And yeah, wait, what's the deadline for this? And then you start paying attention to like little details, but then you notice how I'm like this and it's like you're tense versus when, I'll do a quick hack where I am in state and I did just work out and the endorphins are working out, or another hack is CBD. If you want to supplement with CBD. And I'm like, hey guys, it's totally cool whenever you want to just like get stuff done. And it's like totally awesome. And like, I just want to really tell you, like, I really appreciate like all you're doing for the team. And like, they're just so much more receptive to that. Right. So being aware of that. So
I'm receptive to it. Like I could feel my nervous system shift from the first part of what you said to the second part. Like that's how powerful this is.
Right. And it's how you employ things, even little things, right? Even like I'm like at a 6.5, 7 right now. But if my dial was down to like a 4 and I now am cognizant of like before I have a conversation and I know that I'm at a 4, I go like this. You just smile. It's like, hey, what's going on? Because like when you smile and you're actually like putting yourself in that state, it all of a sudden triggers something in the brain. And next thing you're behaving. And that's, you're behaving in a different way. And that goes into what you had mentioned earlier around influencing yourself. So who is leading who here? So that becomes super interesting.
So when you're smiling, do that again, Nikos. Smile. Okay. Now try to feel angry. Try to feel angry.
Yeah, it becomes like a joke.
You can't do it.
Yeah.
You just can't do it. Right? Physiologically, how we stand, how we manage our body, right, has such a huge impact on our state of mind. Yeah. And so we can do another episode on how to manage the body, but that's a really interesting point you mentioned about smiling. Like when you know you're in a 4, like that's great self-awareness.
Yeah.
Right? So in terms of how to lead, first and foremost, I think I strive to lead by example. If I'm not taking care of myself, I'm not demonstrating integrity. So how do I demonstrate integrity? It's by walking the talk, right? Just making sure that I feel strong, I'm taking care of myself. And so I'm aiming to inspire others to do the same because I believe action speaks louder than words, right? And by consistently living up to the standards that I set. And by standards, I don't mean high standards or low standards, but just standards that work for me, that gets me into that flow state, that gets me into a state wherein I'm pleasant to be around. I'm able to amplify and multiply my team, not divide them. And that's one of the most effective ways that I've learned how to lead.
No, for sure. So as we start to close out this episode, let's get super practical here. And then you can kind of wrap this into maybe some of your final thoughts on neuroleadership itself. How do you start to apply then neuroleadership kind of on a day-to-day basis and tie that to leadership style? I don't know if that's like a before and after question, like what was your style before understanding neuroleadership? But it could also be like, how do you apply this to different leadership styles? Some people lead by authority, some others lead through authenticity. So talk about style of leadership and how you could start to apply neuroleadership depending on your style.
Style of leadership. So for me, I'm all about change. I'm all about transformation. To me, I think that's the game changer. I'm always asking myself, how can I ignite a fire within my team? How can I drive them to embrace change and to strive for them to access their next level, either in my team or in my coaching? That's my driving question, right? But let's be honest, it's not an easy task. Being a transformational leader requires a lot of energy and dedication, and self-care becomes even more paramount. It's an endurance game, right? It's not a sprint. You're constantly going. And so you're always pushing yourself to the limit to bring out the best in your ability. And at the same time, you're trying to live by example, and you're trying to push your team or your client to access their next level, right? The beauty of transformational leadership, it really lies in the power to create a positive impact. So when leaders can inspire their team members because of this high level of self-awareness or the ability to self-regulate and get themselves back into the optimal brain state, it sets off this chain reaction of growth and success. And it's all about fostering that shared vision in an organization. Or in a coaching relationship, it's all about getting, like, everyone I work with, they're going to be successful anyway. I know it. The fact that they've approached, or anyone approaching a coach, the mindset of that individual, they will be successful. The key is, how can we accelerate the success? And I believe neuroleadership, being self-aware and developing the emotional intelligence, those two core pillars that we spoke about, is really the difference that makes all the difference.
Absolutely. So there you have it, folks.
What about you? What's your leadership style, Nikos?
My leadership style has definitely changed through the years. And I believe the transformation was such that I became more aware of just who I am, what I can change and what I can't change. And so being a person of balance, I was born in October, so I'm a Libra. I always add a dimension of creativity in everything that I do, but I also find when things are out of balance, so I tend to shift the energy level to when something needs to be applied. An example is when I feel like there is an environment with such incredibly high rigor and operational tactical sophistication, then I'll throw in an element of, hey guys, we need to think outside the box here. We need to go to a museum and have like a brain spa day and go a little bit different and be a little bit more creative. When I feel like the environment is a little bit too loose, then I apply that operational rigor and say, hey guys, we need to get back in things. We need to drive impact. We need to set schedules. We need to do this. It's almost to the point where I don't want to say schizophrenic, but I can be those two things, those two types of leaders at the same time. But having the awareness of the duality of my style, I think makes it powerful such that I can apply those different dials when needed in the environment that I'm in. So that's how I apply my own awareness and my neuroleadership. And also the authenticity, right? If I'm just having a crap day, I let my team know it. And I say, hey guys, I am not showing up the way that I need to right now. I'm going to need to take a 5 or a 10 or a day or an afternoon to get back to a place where I could lead you better. But I want you to acknowledge that and know that I will be better next time around, because I don't think I'm going to be effective what I'm doing right now. So awareness.
You said that to me a few days ago, to a certain extent.
Yeah. And you said that to me as well. Just like when you're in flow, you know when you're not. And it's just like you can't control these things. And so that's really what it is.
Or can you?
Maybe you can.
I think you can manage it. It can be managed, right? It can be influenced by those tools. Right?
All right, folks. So you've heard it here first from the emergent, aware neuro leader that is Dhiren Harchandani. We covered a lot of ground here. So we went from neuroplasticity and neuroscience to leadership development, impacting yourself, the impact of neurobiology on stress and resilience. We discussed mindfulness and emotional intelligence, as well as the implicit biases that you may have. But really, what it comes down to is leading yourself in a way that's going to be optimal, that's going to be abundant, that employs a lot of self-love. So with that, my friends, stay abundant, stay emergent, and stay positive. Namaste, and we will see you next time on Emergence Now.
Thank you for tuning in to Emergence Now, where we explore the emerging trends, technologies, and ideas that are shaping our world today for you to discover yourself. We hope you have enjoyed this episode and gained valuable insights that you can apply in your own life. If you want to stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And don't forget to follow us on social media, where we share additional content, engage with our community, and keep the conversation going. Thank you for listening to Emergence Now, and we hope you will join us for the next episode.